Jack wiped the sweat off his forehead and leaned back in his chair, staring at the half-repaired engine in front of him. Another long day in his workshop, fixing old machines for people who barely thanked him. Life on the outskirts of the human colony was quiet, too quiet sometimes. He had chosen this solitude, but there were days he wondered if he had made the right choice. Then the sky exploded. A streak of fire tore across the night, followed by a deafening boom that shook the ground. Jack's tools rattled on his workbench. His first thought was a meteor, but then he saw the smoke rising from the nearby forest. His heart pounded. That was no meteor, that was a ship. Without wasting a second, he grabbed his flashlight and rifle and rushed toward the crash site. The forest was thick, the air filled with the scent of burning metal and scorched trees. As he pushed through the undergrowth, he finally saw it, an alien spacecraft half buried in the dirt. The hull was cracked, sparks flying from exposed wires. Jack hesitated. He had never seen this type of ship before. It wasn't human-made. It was sleeker, more advanced. And that meant whoever, or whatever, was inside might not be friendly. Cautiously, he approached the wreckage. The front of the ship had been completely crushed against the trees, but the side door was partially open. Smoke curled from within. He heard a low groan. Someone was alive in there. Jack swallowed hard and stepped forward, pushing the door open with the barrel of his rifle. His flashlight cut through the darkness inside. Wrecked consoles, shattered glass, and a figure. She was slumped against the control panel, breathing, but barely. Jack's breath caught. She was not human. Her skin was a smooth shade of violet, her long silver hair tangled around her face. She was taller than any human woman he had ever seen, her features sharp and elegant. She wore a dark, armored bodysuit that was now torn in places, revealing wounds on her arms. Jack hesitated. She was an alien. Should he help her? What if she was dangerous? What if her people were nearby? Then she groaned again, her head tilting toward him. And for the first time, her golden eyes flickered open. Jack raised his hand slightly. "Hey, easy there. I'm not gonna hurt you." The alien woman blinked, her gaze unfocused. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but only a weak sound came out before she collapsed again. Jack clenched his jaw. Whatever species she was badly injured. He didn't have time to overthink this. With a sigh, he slung his rifle over his shoulder and stepped forward, carefully lifting her into his arms. She was surprisingly light for her height. He could feel the heat of her skin. She was running a fever. "This is a bad idea," he muttered to himself as he carried her out of the wreckage. The walk back to his workshop was slow. Jack kept glancing at the sky, half expecting more alien ships to appear, but the night remained quiet. When he finally reached his place, he kicked the door open and carefully laid her down on the worktable. He grabbed his medkit. Human medicine might not work on her, but it was better than nothing. He cleaned the cuts on her arms, wrapping them in bandages. Her breathing steadied a little, but she was still unconscious. Jack sat down in his chair, rubbing his temples. What now? If the colony found out about her, they might panic. They might try to take her away, experiment on her, or worse. And if her people found out she was here, would they see him as an enemy? He sighed and glanced at her again. Whatever happened next, he had a feeling his quiet, lonely life was over. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. Jack sat in his chair, arms crossed, staring at the unconscious alien woman lying on his worktable. The dim light of his workshop flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the night was silent, except for the distant hum of insects. He still wasn't sure if bringing her here was the right decision. If anyone from the colony found out, there would be questions, too many questions, but he couldn't just leave her there to die. Jack sighed, rubbing his temples. "What the hell am I supposed to do with you?" he muttered. As if in response, the alien woman stirred, her breathing deepened, and then, with a sharp gasp, her golden eyes snapped open. Jack tensed. She sat up so fast that she nearly fell off the table. Her hands shot to her waist, searching for a weapon, maybe, but her movements were sluggish. Her body was still weak. "Hey, easy," Jack said, raising his hands to show he wasn't a threat. "You're hurt." Her gaze locked onto him. Sharp, intense. For a long moment, she didn't move, just studied him like a predator sizing up prey. Then she spoke. Her voice was low and smooth, but the words were unfamiliar. Jack frowned. "I don't understand you." She said something else, this time slower. Different sounds, but still nothing he recognized. Jack exhaled through his nose. Of course, different species, different language. This was going to be a problem. She looked down at herself, her violet fingers brushing over the bandages on her arms. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. Then she looked back at Jack. He pointed at her wounds. "You were hurt. I helped." He patted his own arm, then mind wrapping it with bandages. She watched him closely, golden eyes unreadable. Then she tilted her head slightly, almost like she was considering something. Jack stayed still. Was she deciding if she should trust me or attack me? After a long pause, she pressed a hand against her chest. "Lyra." Jack blinked. Was that her name? She said it again, slower this time. "Lyra." Jack nodded. "Lyra." He pointed at himself. "Jack." Her brow furrowed. "Jacques." He sighed. Close enough. She was still tense, but at least she wasn't trying to strangle him. That was progress. Jack stood up slowly, motioning toward the kitchen. "I bet you're hungry." She didn't react at first, but when he walked to the counter and grabbed a piece of bread, her gaze followed his every move. Jack took a bite, then held it out to her. Hopefully, whatever species she was, bread wouldn't kill her. Lyra eyed it suspiciously, then, after a moment's hesitation, she took it from his hand. She sniffed it first, then carefully bit into it. Her expression didn't change, but she chewed and swallowed. Jack smirked. "See, not poisoned." Lyra glanced at him, then took another bite. Jack leaned against the counter, watching her. She was still guarded, but at least she wasn't trying to escape or attack him. That was something. After she finished eating, she stood up from the table. Jack tensed, ready to stop her if she tried to run, but she didn't. Instead, she studied his workshop, her gaze sweeping over the tools, the half-repaired machines, the shelves filled with spare parts. Then, she pointed at a dismantled engine in the corner. Jack blinked. "You interested in that?" Lyra stepped closer, running her fingers over the metal surface. Then she turned back to Jack and spoke, something in her alien language, her tone questioning. Jack sighed. "Great. Now she wants to talk about engines, and I still don't understand a word she's saying." He walked over and picked up a wrench, tapping it against the engine. "I fix things. It's my job." Lyra watched him, then pointed at the broken ship parts he had brought back from her crash site. Then she pointed at him. Jack raised an eyebrow. "You want me to fix your ship?" She nodded once. Jack let out a breath. Of course. She was stranded here. If she wanted to get off this planet, she needed his help. He crossed his arms. "It's not gonna be easy. Your ship is pretty messed up." Lyra didn't look worried. Instead, she took a step closer and placed a hand on his chest. Jack froze. Her golden eyes locked onto his, and she said something firmly. It wasn't a question this time. It was a statement. Jack swallowed. Why did that feel like a promise? Lyra removed her hand and gestured toward the wrecked parts. Then she crossed her arms, waiting for his answer. Jack exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. He wasn't sure why, but he had a feeling his life had just gotten a lot more complicated. Finally, he sighed and muttered, "All right, let's fix your damn ship." Lyra smirked. And just like that, Jack realized he was in way over his head. Jack wiped grease from his hands and leaned against his workbench, staring at the alien ship parts scattered across the table. Fixing this was going to be one of the hardest jobs he had ever done. Half the components were completely fried, and the technology was far beyond anything human engineers had built. But he wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Across the workshop, Lyra examined the broken pieces of her ship with a focused expression. She was different from before, more alert, more herself. The first day, she had been cautious, studying him like she wasn't sure she could trust him. Now she acted like she belonged here, like this was just another mission she had to complete. Jack wasn't sure how he felt about that. "You understand any of this?" he asked, pointing at a circuit board covered in strange symbols. Lara glanced at him, then at the part. She grabbed a tool from the table, one of his tools, and started making adjustments like she had done it 100 times before. Jack blinked. "Okay, so you do know what you're doing." She smirked but didn't say anything. Jack shook his head and sat down, watching her work. She was fast. Her hands moved with precision, and she barely hesitated. Whatever her job had been before she crashed here, it was clear she had experience with machines. But that wasn't what bothered Jack. It was the way she watched him. Not just when they worked, all the time. Whenever he moved, whenever he spoke, her golden eyes followed him with an intensity that made him uneasy. And then there were the small things, like how she always stood close to him, even when there was plenty of space, or how she had started bringing him food from his own kitchen, as if she was the host and he was the guest. Something was going on, and Jack didn't like not knowing what. After a while, Lara put down her tools and stretched. Jack tried not to stare, but it was hard to ignore how tall she was, at least a head taller than him. She turned to him and said something in her language. Jack sighed. "Still don't understand you." Liara narrowed her eyes, then tapped her temple. Jack frowned. "Your head." She shook her head, frustrated, then pointed at him. "Me?" She nodded, then spoke again, slowly this time. There was something serious in her voice, something important. Jack had no idea what she was trying to say, but whatever it was, she meant it. After a long silence, Lara stepped forward and placed her hand on his chest. Jack froze. This wasn't the first time she had done that, but this time her touch was different, deliberate, firm. She looked into his eyes and spoke again, her voice steady. Jack swallowed. I don't know what you're saying." Liara sighed, then pulled back and crossed her arms, thinking. After a moment, she gestured for him to follow her. Curious, and maybe a little nervous, Jack did. She led him outside, where the night air was cool and quiet. The stars stretched above them, endless and bright. Lyra pointed at the sky. "My home," she said slowly. Then she pointed at herself. "Lyra." Jack nodded. "Yeah, I got that part." Then she turned and pointed at him. "Jack." He raised an eyebrow. "Yes, that's me." Then she did something unexpected. She stepped closer, standing only inches away, and tapped her chest. "Lyra." Then she tapped his chest. "Jack." Then she placed her hand over his. Jack's heart skipped a beat. Lyra's expression was serious. She meant something by this, something more than just names. Jack wasn't an idiot. He had seen enough movies to recognize a moment like this. But that was impossible, right? She was an alien. Still, the way she was looking at him, the way she stood close, the way she spoke his name like it was something important. A realization hit him like a punch to the gut. She wasn't just asking for help. She had chosen him. Jack took a step back, running a hand through his hair. "Oh, no. 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 This is not what I signed up for." Liara tilted her head, confused by his reaction. Jack let out a nervous laugh. "Listen, I get it. You're grateful. And maybe where you're from, this is how things work. But, humans don't exactly." Liara took another step toward him. Jack backed up again. "Move this fast." Liara narrowed her eyes, then crossed her arms. She spoke again, her voice firm. Jack sighed. I really need a translator. Liara shook her head, clearly frustrated. Then she pointed at herself and made a fist over her heart. Then she pointed at him. Jack didn't know what that gesture meant, but he had a very bad feeling about it. Before he could say anything, Liara turned and walked back toward the workshop, her posture stiff. Jack let out a long breath. Well, I think I just got engaged to an alien warrior. He rubbed his face. This was getting way too complicated. And yet, when he looked at Liara again, something in his chest stirred. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't so bad. Jack sat on the edge of his workbench, staring at the scattered ship parts and tools. His mind, however, wasn't on the repairs. It was on her. Liara. The alien woman had barely spoken to him all morning. She was working on a damaged console, her fingers moving with quick precision, but her shoulders were tense. Jack exhaled and rubbed his face. He still wasn't sure what had happened last night. One moment, they were talking, or at least trying to talk, and the next, she was looking at him like he was supposed to understand something important. Then she made that fist over heart gesture. And now she was ignoring him. Jack was good with machines, not people, especially not alien women who might or might not have just declared him her mate. After a few minutes of silence, he cleared his throat. Hey, Liara. She didn't look up. Jack scratched the back of his head. Look, if I said something wrong, I'd... Before he could finish, Liara grabbed a metal panel and slammed it onto the table with more force than necessary. Jack flinched. All right. That's fine. We can just not talk. He turned back to his work, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. After a few minutes, Liara suddenly stood up and marched outside. Jack blinked. Okay, guess I'm taking a break too. With a sigh, he wiped his hands on a rag and followed her out. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Liara stood near the edge of the clearing, looking up at the sky. Jack stopped a few feet behind her, unsure if he should speak. She looked tired. Not physically. He could tell she was strong. But there was something else. Something deeper. Finally, he decided to take a chance. You miss your home, don't you? Liara didn't turn, but after a pause, she nodded. Jack sighed and crossed his arms. Yeah, I figured. Silence stretched between them. Then, Liara pointed at the sky. Vashera. Jack frowned. That's your home. She nodded again. Jack followed her gaze, trying to imagine what her planet looked like. Was it anything like Earth? Or was it something completely different, something alien and beautiful? Liara suddenly turned to him and tapped her chest. Liara. Then she pointed at the sky again. Vashera. Jack watched her, trying to understand. You're saying you're from Vashera? Liara hesitated, then shook her head. She stepped closer and pointed at herself again. Liara. Then she pointed at him. Jack. Then she pointed at the sky and made the same fist over heart gesture she had done last night. Jack swallowed hard. He wasn't great at reading people, but this he understood. She wasn't just telling him where she was from. She was telling him that she had made a choice. Jack exhaled, rubbing his face. Look, Liara, I don't think you understand how humans work. We don't just... Before he could finish, Liara suddenly stepped forward and grabbed his wrist. Jack's breath caught. Her grip was gentle but firm, and when he looked up, her golden eyes were locked onto his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. She spoke again, slowly, her voice softer this time. Jack didn't know the words, but somehow he felt them. This wasn't just about gratitude. This was something else. Liara released his wrist and stepped back. Then, without another word, she turned and walked back toward the workshop. Jack stood frozen for a long moment, his heart pounding. He looked up at the sky, then back at Liara's retreating form. Maybe he had been wrong about her. And maybe, just maybe, his quiet, lonely life had just changed forever. Jack had never felt more confused in his life. He was good at fixing things, machines, engines, broken ship parts, but this was something he couldn't fix with a wrench. Liara had made her choice clear, even without words, but Jack wasn't sure if he could accept it. She was an alien, from a world far beyond anything he could imagine. She had a life before she crashed here, a home waiting for her somewhere among the stars. So why was she looking at him like he was her home now? Jack exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He needed a distraction, something to clear his head. Luckily, he had plenty of work to do. The next morning, Jack focused on repairing the ship's power core. It was one of the most damaged parts, and without it, there was no way Liara would be able to leave this planet. She worked beside him, silent but efficient. The tension from yesterday had faded slightly, replaced by something different. Not quite comfortable, but not hostile either. A silent understanding. They worked in sync, passing tools back and forth without speaking. At one point, Jack handed her a screwdriver before she even asked for it. She paused, giving him a curious look. Jack shrugged. Figured you'd need it. Liara smirked slightly but said nothing. For a while, they just worked. Then, out of nowhere, Liara spoke. Jack. He looked up. She tapped the broken power core. Fix. Jack sighed. Trying. She frowned, then pointed at the part again. Fix. Jack wiped sweat from his forehead. Yeah, I'm working on it. It's not exactly easy. Liara crossed her arms, watching him carefully. Then she tapped her chest. Liara. Jack raised an eyebrow. Yeah, I know your name. She shook her head, then pointed at him. Jack. Then she pointed at the ship, then at the sky. Jack frowned. You want me to fix the ship so you can leave? Liara hesitated. Then, slowly, she shook her head. Jack's stomach twisted. That wasn't what he expected. She stepped closer, placing a hand on the power core. Fix. Then she touched her chest. Liara. Jack swallowed. You want me to fix it, but you're not planning to leave. She nodded once. Jack exhaled. Liara. Why? Her golden eyes locked onto his, steady and sure. She placed a hand over her heart and said something. Soft, but firm. Jack didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. She had already decided. His chest felt tight. He should have been relieved, maybe even happy, but instead, he felt lost. This wasn't just some stranded alien needing repairs anymore. This was something else. Something that scared him. Jack turned back to the power core, gripping the wrench tightly. We should focus on the repairs. Liara didn't argue. She just nodded and got back to work. But Jack could still feel her gaze on him, and he had no idea what to do about it. This is part 5. Let me know if you want any changes or if you'd like me to continue with part 6. You said, part 6 to 850 words ka leko or interesting hunachaya or third-person style malekni ha or simple basic English ka. Don't use any violated word. So please avoid any violated content. ChatGPT said. Part 6. The choice he didn't expect. Jack had always been a simple man, fixing broken things, living a quiet life away from the chaos of the world. That was enough for him. But ever since Liara crashed into his life, nothing had been simple. Now he had a problem. Not just the ship, which was still half broken. Not just the language barrier, which was frustrating but manageable. No, his real problem was Liara herself. She had made it clear she wasn't leaving. Even if he fixed her ship, even if she had the chance to return to her home, she had chosen to stay with him. Jack didn't know how to feel about that. It wasn't that he disliked her. In fact, That was the problem. He had gotten used to her being here. The way she worked beside him, the way she watched him with those intense golden eyes, the way she seemed to understand him even without words. She had become a part of his life, and that scared him more than anything. They spent most of the day working on the power core. Jack was making progress, but some parts were beyond repair. He would have to replace them with human tech, which meant making adjustments. Lara worked alongside him, silent but focused. Jack stole a glance at her as she tightened a bolt. She was strong, her movements precise and controlled. But there was a softness to her too, a quiet patience he had come to appreciate. She caught him staring and raised an eyebrow. Jack coughed and looked away. "You're, good at this." Liara tilted her head. "Good?" Jack nodded. "Yeah, smart, skilled." Liara smirked slightly, then pointed at the power core. "Fix." Jack sighed. "Getting there." She nodded, then tapped her chest. "Liara." Jack frowned. "Yeah, I know your name." But she wasn't just saying her name. She was reminding him. Jack swallowed hard. "Liara." She pointed at him. "Jack." Then she placed a hand over her heart. "Liara." Jack's breath caught. She wasn't just reminding him of her name. She was reminding him of her choice. She had chosen him. And now, she was waiting for him to choose too. Jack exhaled, rubbing his face. "You really don't make things easy, do you?" Liara tilted her head, confused. Jack shook his head and got back to work. For now, fixing the ship was the only thing he could focus on. Because once it was done, he'd have to face the truth. And he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. The ship was finally fixed. Jack stepped back, wiping sweat from his forehead as he stared at the humming power core. It had taken weeks of work, but it was running, barely, but enough to fly. He should have felt relieved. Instead, his chest felt heavy. Because now, there was nothing stopping Liara from leaving. Jack turned to her, but she was already looking at him, watching, waiting. She knew what he was thinking. Jack took a slow breath. "It's done. You can go home now." Liara didn't move. She just kept watching him, her golden eyes unreadable. Jack rubbed the back of his neck. "I mean, that was the whole point, right? Fix the ship, get you back to your people." Still, she said nothing. Jack sighed, looking away. "You should go. You don't belong here." Silence. Then, softly, Liara spoke. "Jack." He looked at her. She stepped closer, lifting a hand. Slowly, gently, she placed it over her heart. Then, she reached out and pressed that same hand against his chest. Jack swallowed hard. She didn't need words. He understood. She had already chosen. Jack felt his heart pounding. "Liara, are you sure?" She nodded, her expression steady. Jack exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had spent so long pushing people away, choosing machines over human connection. But this was different. Liara wasn't just someone. She was Liara. And she had chosen him. Slowly, hesitantly, Jack lifted his own hand and placed it over hers. A small smile formed on Liara's lips. For the first time, in a long time, Jack smiled back. Maybe fixing things wasn't just about machines. Maybe it was about finding something worth holding on to. Something, someone, who made the work worth it. And as he looked into Liara's golden eyes, Jack knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning.